For some analysis, we're now joined by Andrea Prasow, who's the Deputy Director at Human Rights Watch in Washington. Andrea, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Welcome to the program.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
All right. I suppose once the United States and NATO decided that enough was enough and they were pulling out of Afghanistan, what we're seeing now probably was an inevitability. With that in mind, what did you make of President Biden's speech last night?
Well, people have spent a lot of time trying to blame other people for what's happening, and I would really like a little bit of focus on how we can help people going forward. But what I was most disappointed about from that speech was that it didn't address how to help the Afghans who are in immediate need. The U.S. government is attempting to evacuate people, not quickly enough, in my view, and it wasn't planned well enough in advance. It should have started quite some time ago. Nevertheless, they are working on that now, but we didn't hear any focus on that from the president yesterday. I was also really disappointed to hear individual Afghan soldiers and security forces blamed. I think the failure of leadership is clear. Human Rights Watch has extensively documented how Afghan government officials have governed with impunity. The U.S. has repeatedly documented the corruption at play. But we're talking about asking individual men and some women who sometimes don't get paid for months, who don't have enough food, who are at risk of insider attacks, to ask them to lay down their lives when their leaders are not supporting them. So in that sense, that part was quite disappointing. I think that the attempt to shift blame without any acknowledgement of the role that the U.S. has played in creating the situation that is present in Afghanistan right now, I think that was a mistake. And I hope that we'll see a change in what we hear from the president going forward.
So the most pressing need right now is to make sure that everybody at risk is evacuated. But sadly, it doesn't look like everybody's going to get out, though, is it?
It doesn't. And when you look at the numbers that countries have pledged to take, which is wonderful, and more countries need to do more, I have no idea how that number of people could ever get out of the country. It's just not possible if you calculate how many people can fit on a particular plane, even if it's packed to the gills, as we saw one was yesterday. The U.S. needs to urgently be negotiating with the Taliban for continued access to the airport. The U.S. needs to secure the airport for as long as possible. If that means extending past the August 31st deadline for withdrawal, then so be it. That airport has to be kept open and running, not just to military flights, but to commercial flights, to charter flights, to allow people to leave the country. That is one logistical component of this. But people also need to be able to get to the airport, do so safely, not be at risk of checkpoints, not be at risk of being turned away by the Taliban who may not want them to evacuate. So that needs to be addressed as well. And then, of course, once people leave the country, they have to have somewhere to go. They have to be supported. They have to be granted parole in the U.S. or other countries. They have to be resettled. There needs to be a global commitment to help these people who are fleeing. There was a global commitment to fight in Afghanistan. There needs to be a global commitment to support the Afghans who need to be protected now.
The Taliban today have said that they'll grant amnesty to anyone who is aligned to the U.S. Does this serve as some comfort for the people that we saw clamoring onto a U.S. flight yesterday, hoping to be evacuated?
I don't think so, because working with the U.S. or a U.S.-funded organization or supporting the U.S., those are not crimes. Someone doesn't need to have amnesty granted for that kind of conduct. The question is, will the Taliban respect human rights? And if they are the governing authority, will they fulfill Afghanistan's commitments to a variety of human rights treaties, which include the right to life, of course, the right to be free from torture, the right to education, regardless of one's gender. Women and girls have the right to education, to healthcare, the right to a free media to obtain information. That's one of the concerns that we've documented in the past in Taliban-controlled areas. We've seen significant restrictions on media. That means as the rest of the world in the coming days and weeks and months wants to know what's happening in Afghanistan, we may not be able to get a clear picture if independent media is not allowed to work in Afghanistan. So those are the commitments I'd like to see. An amnesty over real or imagined crimes is not really the best indicator for how the Taliban will govern.
The Taliban are talking a pretty good talk at the moment, but in the lead up to taking over the country and taking Kabul, in one of your reports, you say that they summarily executed, detained soldiers, police and civilians with alleged ties to the Afghan government. And I suppose that points to their modus operandi as it's been for a long time.
I think there's long been a question of how the Taliban would govern if they actually had control of the entire government. They have controlled significant geographic areas for some time, and Human Rights Watch has documented abuses in those areas. Governing an entire country is a different story. I don't mean to suggest that they would be less abusive. I don't know. But I think that they will have some real governance challenges, and they recognize that they need international money in order to continue to run the Afghan government. And the international donors will not contribute those funds if they believe human rights are not being respected, at least at some level. Now, that doesn't mean that humanitarian actors shouldn't continue to support aid in Afghanistan. Humanitarian money needs to continue to go to support health, to support education. But international donors will not be sending billion-dollar checks to the Taliban if they are not respecting human rights. I think the Taliban are aware of that, but I don't know what that will look like as it plays out in the future, and I don't know if they will find alternative sources of funds, perhaps not coming from the West.
One issue that keeps being brought up again based on past actions is the rights of women and how they may be compromised under a Taliban government. Is this something that you're worried about? They are saying, though, that they want women to be educated and they want women to join their government. Do you think that might be more speak, and perhaps that the challenges that women will face will be great nevertheless?
We're gravely concerned about the rights of women and girls in the future of Afghanistan. Now, the Taliban have in most areas allowed, if one could use that word, even though education is a right, they have allowed girls to go to school, at least until puberty in most areas, though, of course, there are areas in Afghanistan where girls were not allowed to go to school at all. Now, of course, the Afghan government also did not have the strongest record on access to education. It's not the case that only the Taliban had challenges with respect to running schools. But we will be looking to see whether, first of all, that continues. But what about higher education for women? Can women continue to study to be doctors and lawyers, to be judges, to serve in government? Those are the things that we will be watching. I think that we are hearing a lot of commitments now, and the Taliban need to be held to those commitments. But we also need to be realistic about what we can expect based on past practice.
What other areas of concern do you have with this takeover by the Taliban in terms of human rights for citizens?
Access to education, particularly for women and girls, is one area of concern. Access to healthcare. Will women be allowed to see whatever doctor they want, male or female? Will women be allowed to go to medical school and then treat women and men, boys and girls, as needed? We will be watching the treatment of detainees. Will there be reprisals, killings, torture, detention of former government soldiers or officials? Different things like that we're concerned about. Now, access, I mentioned before, a free media. That is really a key component of a free society. Will journalists be allowed to operate freely and report on what they want? We've documented challenges with free speech in Taliban-controlled areas. Those are some of the things that we'll be looking at closely.
Yeah, they say that women would be allowed to work as journalists, but they would not be allowed to be in the company of men, which pretty much gives them no chance of doing real journalism. But it wasn't just the Taliban that women were struggling against as well. The Afghan government doesn't have a great record, particularly in dealing with violence against women. The justice system seemed to have been failing them. So I guess the fear is that a bad situation might be even getting worse.
You're absolutely right. We just released a report last week on really the lost opportunity. The Afghan government hasn't implemented the violence against women law. And in areas of protecting women fleeing from domestic violence in particular, we saw really a real disregard, a real lack of recognition that women needed to be protected from domestic violence. So that was a failure on the Afghan government's part. There isn't a reason to believe it will be better under the Taliban. I don't know that it will necessarily be worse, but there are certain aspects of the real, really uncontested gains that women in particular have experienced over the last 20 years that are very likely to disappear in the coming weeks and months. That doesn't mean that things were rosy under the Afghan government, but what we hope is that there will be a time ideally in the near future, but at some point in the future, when Afghanistan is really a free and democratic society where people can fully exercise their human rights. But I don't think that that's imminent.
And I suppose if we are to follow what they've said in the past, girls up until puberty may be fine to a degree, but once puberty kicks in, then there aren't enough schools for girls to go to girls-only schools, which means there is probably a generation of young girls, women, who are going to lose out.
I think that's right. And that's even supposing that a girls-only school is an adequate choice for girls who might want education. Of course, it's not. They should be able to go to the school of their choice with the teachers of their choice. Education is a serious concern that we have. There's also what type of school will girls or anyone be allowed to attend? Will they be schools that also have secular teachings in addition to religious teachings, if that's deemed appropriate? Or will they only be allowed to attend purely religious schools? Will schools be protected? Afghanistan has signed the Safe Schools Declaration. Will schools be used for military purposes if there's continued fighting? Or will they be kept sacrosanct for education as they're supposed to be? There are a lot of serious concerns about education in particular and the way that children will be growing up in Afghanistan.
All right, and perhaps finally, in the immediate situation, I guess it's dealing with refugees and people that are leaving and fleeing Afghanistan. But beyond that, what should the international community be doing to help the people of Afghanistan?
The immediate need absolutely is the evacuation. And it's not just through the airport, it's also on land. So neighboring countries really need to be opening up their borders and assisting Afghan refugees or people fleeing Afghanistan, whether they might ultimately get refugee status or not. The international community has to use whatever leverage it has. Afghanistan has to be treated like any other nation where it's clear that Afghanistan needs to fulfill its obligations. One thing to do, for example, is to welcome a fact-finding mission from the Human Rights Council, allow international documentation of any potential crimes. There is, of course, an ongoing investigation by the International Criminal Court. The U.S. has objected to that investigation. Ideally, it would drop that objection and allow the ICC to fully and adequately investigate crimes that have occurred in Afghanistan over the years by all parties, whether it's international forces, the Taliban, Afghan government, previous Afghan government, and so on. There needs to be a real robust accounting of crimes that have occurred and accountability for people who've committed those crimes.
Andrea Prasow, Deputy Director at Human Rights Watch in Washington, thank you so much indeed for joining us, and let's hope that the wishes that you've put out there can be fulfilled and fulfilled urgently. Thank you so much for your time. All right, that's Andrea Prasow joining us from Washington, painting a concerning picture in Afghanistan and human rights abuses, a fear for those in the coming period. But certainly immediately the issue is making sure that the Afghans who want to be evacuated get access and find a home somewhere outside the country.